end slavery, to break down Jim Crow, to end segregation, to gain the right to vote, and to achieve the sacred birthright of equality. Here, that's big stuff. That's big stuff. Those are very big phrases, very big words.
Well, good morning and welcome to AM Joy. Donald Trump may have been going for irony Saturday when he spoke at the opening of a civil rights museum in Jackson, Mississippi. It was a speech undermined not just by his entire record on African Americans and other minority communities, but also by the fact that just hours before, in front of a crowd of fervent supporters, he played all the race-baiting, press-bashing hits of the past few years and then threw in a new one, a full-throated endorsement of a certain Alabama Senate candidate who just months ago said this.
What does Trump mean? What does people mean to make it great again?
I think it was great at a time when families were united. Even though we had slavery, they cared for one another. People were strong in the families. Our families were strong. Our country had a direction, and we corrected many of the problems.
Now, even before all the allegations of sexual misconduct emerged, Roy Moore was on the record about longing for the antebellum days of slavery, questioning Barack Obama's birth certificate, and feeling a kinship with Russian leader Vladimir Putin. And now, with polls showing a tight race ahead of the vote on Tuesday, Moore's campaign is warning of, wait for it, voter fraud, and claiming that Soros' army is in the state registering voters. Now, if all this sounds familiar, it's because Donald Trump ran on many of these same positions. And now that it's his Republican Party, it's becoming Roy Moore's party as well. And joining me now is Evan Siegfried, Republican strategist, and Jason Johnson, MSNBC contributor and politics editor for TheRoot.com, as well as Karine Jean-Pierre, senior advisor for MoveOn.org, and Derrick Johnson, president and CEO of the NAACP. And Derrick, I'm going to come to you first, Mr. NAACP president. I'm going to come to you first. Roy Moore has a history that I think a lot of Americans who are not familiar with him beyond his 10 Commandments fight are just getting to know. And this is actually clipped through for my producers who are not forewarned. There's a BuzzFeed article that talked about Roy Moore back in 1995 addressing a white supremacist group called the Council of Conservative Citizens. He once addressed the semi-annual national conference of that group, the white supremacist group, that alleged that Charleston shooter Dylan Storm Roof cited as a formative influence on his online manifesto. What should people know about Roy Moore's racial views in addition to what we know about his views on LGBT Americans and on things like monuments and his dating predilections?
Well, the CCC is an offshoot of the White Citizens Councils from the 1950s and 60s. It was also the group that was linked to former U.S. Senator Trent Lott. It is a racial hate group headquartered for many years in Mississippi. The mere fact that he would have been invited, accepted the invitation, and spoke to that group speaks volumes to his empathy or his beliefs around race. He is a racist. There's no other way to put it, because anybody who will speak to that group, espouse their interests or support their platform, can be nothing else but a racist.
And let me play for our audience some classic Roy Moore doing his birther thing. This is from December of 2016, and this comes from CNN's Andrew Kaczynski. Take a listen to this.
My personal belief is that he wasn't, but that's probably overdone in a few days, unless we get something else to come along.
And Derrick, are African Americans in the state familiar? Do they know this part of Roy Moore's history? And do you think that black voters are energized around this race?
Well, when you look at the history of the South, particularly states like Alabama or South Carolina or Mississippi, this type personality have always been around. And African American, we can identify individuals who hold the same views as a Roy Moore. So I would be surprised if there was an African American in Alabama who could not clearly see through or see Roy Moore for who he is. He is someone that has very little race tolerance. For him, the good old days were the days when segregation was in place and perhaps even slavery, because white supremacy is something that many individuals who are similarly situated as he is in their views truly believe in this concept of white supremacy.
Well, and we should note that, African-American voters are about 26% of the voters in the state. Even if 100% of the voters turned out, it's not African-American voters, Evan, that are going to determine who wins in Alabama. It's going to be white voters who are something like 90+% Republicans. Roy Moore is using something out of the Donald Trump playbook to appeal to them. In addition to denying the claims of being a serial child molester, there is a flyer that was put out that is essentially accusing Doug Jones of doing something that is, really not really controversial, but of him publicly supporting NFL players kneeling to protest the national anthem. So he's going for sort of the Donald Trump playbook.
Well, Doug Jones is supporting the First Amendment and the right to kneel and express one's political opinions. My goodness, we've seen time and time again that Roy Moore has no respect for the Constitution. He himself has said that the Constitution is one set of laws, however, God's law supersedes that. And the Constitution was founded on the exact opposite of this. I've never seen Roy Moore devote himself to the Constitution. He's been twice removed from from the Alabama State Supreme Court for ignoring federal court orders. So he's shown himself not to be there. And one thing that is really disturbing, right now Roy Moore is going on doors, knocking and asking for people's votes. The only reason he should be going on doors is to tell people he's not allowed within 500 yards of a school. And that's the only thing he should be doing right now for Alabama voters. But Alabama voters are saying, you know what, it's okay because we want to get that vote, and Donald Trump's behind it. Donald Trump has opened the door for people to say things that they believed that are not normally acceptable, and it's really moral rot within the Republican Party.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's look at one other. This is a pro-Jones. No, I'm sorry. This is Donald Trump is actually. Let me actually switch to number 6. This is a panel that Frank Luntz did, and Frank Luntz is, of course, a pollster who. He does a lot of focus groups. This is one of the focus groups, and you can hear some voters, some Roy Moore voters, doing exactly what you just talked about, Evan. Take a listen.
Roy Moore is not a miserable man. This man has more integrity than you can find in the entire Congress right now. Don't fall for the George Soros assassination plan. The truth will come out. These women are all going to be proven, just like the 16 that went against President Trump.
So people are essentially not embarrassed about supporting Roy Moore. They're full-throated support of him, and they don't believe his accusers. They think he has integrity.
Well, remember, Roy Moore 2 weeks ago came out and said they are the ones who are doing it. They are George Soros funded. They are Democrats. They are the establishment. The women who are accusing Roy Moore are Republicans who wear MAGA hats. They voted for Donald Trump by their own admission, and now they're being tarred and feathered by their own crowd for having the temerity to actually speak up and say Roy Moore is a child predator. If that doesn't give people pause, then I don't know what will. Yeah. It's very distressing.
It's interesting, and I want to let me come to open this up to Jason and Karine as well. This is a clip that I just saw for the first time last night, actually. And this is Roy Moore talking not just about his views on LGBT Americans, which I don't think will be surprising to people, but also revealing something that, maybe I just haven't been paying attention, his pro-Putin views. So let's take a listen.
To assess what Ronald Reagan would think, I just couldn't simply begin.
But he said that Russia was the focus of evil in the modern world.
You could say that very well about America, couldn't you?
Do you think?
Well, we promote a lot of bad things,
Like?
Same-sex marriage.
That's the very argument that Vladimir Putin makes.
Well, then maybe Putin is right.
And then, Karine, he goes on to speak some pretty good Russian. He sort of greets Vladimir Putin in the Russian language. But it is interesting that he also has this pro-Putin view, and they line up on this idea of being opposed to LGBT rights.
Yeah, not surprising at all, Joy. I think we have to step back for one quick second and remember who had the seat for 20 years, and that is Jeff Sessions. And we have to go back to, if you look back to 1986, Jeff Sessions was deemed to be too racist to become a federal judge, and then 11 years later, Alabama decided that he could be a U.S. senator, and he was in that seat, as I mentioned, for 20 years. And now he's at the Department of Justice, and he's pushing the most rapid and, bigoted, racist pieces of legislation that we haven't seen in a long time coming out of the DOJ. And then the other part about that too is that Roy Moore, in September when he won the runoff, he was already racist. He was already Islamophobic. He was already homophobic, and still he won the runoff by 10 points. And so, this is all before we found out about him being a pedophile. So this is Alabama. This is the state that we're talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. And, look at the polls here, Jason. You've got another poll that shows the race locked up. And I'm not sure, what to make of all these polls because they'll show Doug Jones up sometimes. These seem to be more in line with the anecdotal evidence that you're hearing on the ground that Roy Moore is genuinely ahead. There's a Gravis poll that asks, do you believe the accusations against Roy Moore? More people believe them than don't believe them. I'm not sure that that's really hurting him, Jason.
No, it's not, Joy. And look, if you look at the history of this state, I went back and looked, when Jeff Sessions ran against Vivian Figueres, when Jeff Sessions ran against Sanchez, Democrats can't break 40% in this state. They just can't. The fact that Doug Jones is right now around 43 or 44, it's impressive. But think about it. For a Democrat to break 40% in the state, you have to be running against a man who is a clear bigot and an alleged pedophile. That says something about how Alabama voters look at Democrats in general. So, I've always thought Roy Moore was going to win. He's probably going to win by 5, 6, 7 points. And then the Republicans are going to have to deal with that guy talking in the Senate all throughout the 2018 midterms.
And that is the point, Evan, is that if Roy Moore wins, and let's not, call the race before it happens, people still have to vote, but if Roy Moore wins, then your party's stuck with him. And what are they going to do? They're not going to have the excuse of trying to point to the completely different situation of Al Franken and point at him. He's not going to be there.
Good. Because we should judge each case on a case-by-case basis. And Roy Moore still, even if he wins, I don't think they should seat him. It would actually be good for Republicans to stand up and say, we will stand up for women and victims.
They're going to
Cory Gardner's still standing up and saying he shouldn't be seated, and I'm proud of that. Unfortunately, can we get enough Republican senators to do that? No, they're saying, well, we'll let the ethics investigation play out. But my big concern is with ethics investigations is they're toothless. When have they actually achieved results? You have a system built to protect the incumbent.
Yeah.
And Roy Moore, if he wins, Wednesday morning, first thing will be the incumbent. The one thing I will say that I think Democrats have going for them politically if Roy Moore wins is that it's going to energize more and more women and be a shot in the arm to organize and move for 2018.
Yeah, and Karine Jean-Pierre, it's also going to refocus people's attention on the guy in the White House that's got some pretty serious allegations hanging out there against him, too, and who has inserted himself into this race. Let's listen to Roy Moore's strategist, a guy named Dean Young, who's on This Week on ABC, talking about Trump's role in this Alabama race.
Last night we had Doug Jones, the liberal Democrat, with one of his Senate buddies, Cory Booker, who said that the president should resign. So this is Donald Trump on trial in Alabama. If the people of Alabama vote for this liberal Democrat, Doug Jones, then they're voting against the president who they put in office at the highest level.
So, Karine, you've had Jeff Merkley come out and say that Donald Trump should, that if Al Franken has to step down, Donald Trump should too. Cory Booker said the same thing in Alabama. Are you going to start to hear some of those Democratic women who stood up and said that Al Franken should resign from the Senate if Roy Moore comes in, turn that same vitriol on Roy Moore, make those same demands of Moore, but also on Donald Trump?
Yes, and that's what Democrats should absolutely be doing because, as they tried to do this week, they now have the moral high ground on this. Okay, if you have the moral high ground on this, let's actually focus on the man who's at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and say to him that he needs to step down. He is a sexual assaulter. We have about more than a dozen women that came out and said this and sound very credible. And if we are in this Me Too movement and we're saying we believe the women, then we should do that. Believe the women and go after the president of the United States, Donald Trump. And it's kind of, it's really troubling, Joy, that Donald Trump is using the prestige and the power of the White House to give a full-throated endorsement and to campaign for a pedophile. People, for credible, people come out and said he is a pedophile for going after 14-year-olds, for going after teenagers. But then, if you think about it, it's not surprising that Donald Trump, who himself would walk through teenage teenage dressing rooms for beauty pageants is now also endorsing someone who got kicked out, banned from a mall in Alabama for targeting teenagers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to go to Derrick Johnson just for one more question, just to go back where we started this segment. Of course, Donald Trump did give that speech in Mississippi at the Civil Rights Museum. I want to get your comments on the boycott of that event by John Lewis, by Benny Thompson of Mississippi. What did you make of that? Was that the most effective way to respond to Donald Trump showing up?
Well, absolutely. The opening of the civil rights movement was an opportunity to celebrate individuals, many of whom are still alive, their accomplishments, their sacrifices, and neither Congressman Thompson, Lewis, or I were willing to cede the stage to give the president a photo op. There is no commitment to the individuals, the values that they stood for, the fight they took on. You think about Medgar Evers. He was fighting to ensure that everyone had access to voting and quality education. The president don't support that. You think about Dr. Robert Smith and Dr. Geithner through the civil rights movement, who said that access to health care was a civil rights, and they fought and created a rural community health center that still exists today. This president don't support having access to health care for all citizens. So why should anyone give the stage to the president so he can have a photo op only to fight against us with the voting commission cutting funds to support all of the things that civil rights workers fought for? Yes, it was the most effective because we're still celebrating the civil rights heroes. We are talking to them. We're going to have another ceremony, but by no means should we have a photo op for the president.
All right. Well, Evan, Jason, and Karine will be back in our next hour. Derrick Johnson, thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it. And up next.